Welcome back to iGen Politics. This is a podcast that makes politics engaging and relevant for all generations. This is Victor Shi. I'm currently a sophomore at UCLA, was elected as the youngest delegate for Joe Biden, and also co-host this podcast.
And I'm Jill Wine-Banks, the author of The Watergate Girl, based on my experience in the Watergate trial and tapes hearing. I'm also known for the pins that I wear, hashtag Jill's Pins. And today I'm wearing actually two pins because our guest, Fiona Hill, deserves two pins. One is a American flag, which of course is part of the cover of her book, which I'm holding up, is got an American flag prominently displayed on it. And the other is a white rose, which is for her birthplace. The time of the War of the Roses between the Red Queen and the White Queen. And so that's why I'm wearing two pins today.
The problems facing Americans and the world are daunting and the solutions are scarce. How to rise and succeed in the 21st century in the face of these problems is what Fiona Hill, our guest today, writes about in her new book, There Is Nothing for You Here, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century. It's a book that powerfully describes what Fiona has learned through her many high-powered experiences and makes clear why expanding opportunity is the only long-term hope for democracy. Those who have watched our show in the past know that Fiona is a friend of the podcast and are aware of her impressive background. If you missed Fiona's previous iGen Politics podcast appearances, here are some of her career highlights. She is now a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, but from 2017 to 2019, she served as deputy assistant to the president and senior director for European and Russian affairs on the National Security Council. She was a powerful witness during the first impeachment hearing. Her expertise is also the basis of several books, including one she co-authored, Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin. We are so thrilled to be joined by Fiona back on the podcast today. Thank you so much for being here, Fiona.
Oh, thanks, Victor. It's great to be with you again.
And we're looking forward to talking at length about your newest book, which is a combination of a memoir and a history book. And as the author of a memoir myself, I'm particularly interested in focusing in on the memoir side. Of course, when we talked last March, it was about Putin and your book about him. And you, at the time, were working on this book. It wasn't published yet. And you said you were trying to find the right balance between history and memoir. And first of all, congratulations, because I think you got a very good balance between analysis and your own life and how history impacted you personally. And I know how hard that is. I struggled with that. And so how did you find that right balance in this book?
Well, thanks, Jill. And, remembering back to March, actually, that was a bit of a painful time when I was talking to you guys. I was quite happy to be talking about the book on Putin and Putin himself rather than the one I was working on, because that was a period when I'd actually written the book initially thematically and using kind of memoir more as vignettes, personal experiences to sort of illustrate some of the themes. And it really didn't work. It was too confusing because there was no through line. All of the material that's in the current book was there, but this is just like a little writer's 101 session now that we have. But apart from, for me, kind of my victim readers, including the editor, went, yeah, great material, but where's the plot gone? And I thought, yeah, the storyline. Because every book needs a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? Kind of, and especially if you want people to read it, and it's not just, give me more of an academic book. And this was, very much pitched at the general audience, everybody. And so I found myself going back to my own personal story and using that as the through line, as the vehicle. So memoir becomes the plot in a way for part of the book. And that's how I balance things out, because I can't say that I had it, right away at the beginning. I felt like, the big themes that I was trying to get across of populism and deindustrialization and, some of the complexities of being a woman in all of this, my own, sort of personal experiences. I had them all sort of divided out in a totally different way. So eventually I had to do it with, kind of starting with my own, birth onwards kind of thing, 1965, right. When I was born, and then onwards to the kind of the present day, to have a kind of chronology there.
Well, it definitely worked.
I became the vehicle for the rest of the book.
Right. And that was the advice I got from my editor, who said, your themes are good, and you have to then tell personal stories that relate to those two themes. So if it relates to democracy and justice working, bipartisanship, it goes in. If it relates to the trial and justice, it goes in. If it relates to the hurdles you had to overcome as a woman, it goes in. Otherwise, all of this goes out. And that's how
exactly.
Yeah.
So let's just say there's a lot of material
Yes, exactly.
that got discarded, so it's like literally the cutting room floor. But anyway, I think, a lot of people who are, listening in here might themselves be thinking, one day about writing a book. And I think this is just, it's not, you don't just sort of write and then you're going to finish it. In a way, you have to often look at the material and, like anything, right? And then think about how are you going to shape it and how are you going to get the larger message across? What is the point of everything? And then how does everything that you're considering putting in the book carry the larger points and the themes across, just as you said, Jill, as well?
Okay, so let's look at the cover of your book. And for those of you who are listening and watching on YouTube, you can see the cover, which features an American flag, which is one of my 2 pins today, hanging down from the window of what looks like a decaying structure, I would say. And
it looks like a storefront, maybe.
But decaying. I mean, it's definitely not in good condition. And that kind of, I think, encapsulates some of the themes of your book. So I thought it might be good to start with you maybe describing those main themes of your book.
Well, the title of the book, There Is Nothing for You Here, was something that my father said to me in 1984 when I was leaving the equivalent of high school in the UK. And there was a massive unemployment crisis in the UK overall, but for youth, a really serious unemployment crisis. So most kids who were leaving school had nothing immediately to go on to, which is often a familiar theme for people, right? I mean, still here in the United States, unless you've got college lined up. So, Victor, if you're kind of thinking back to, high school and those dilemmas of what you were going to do, obviously going to college, is one, way of setting yourself on the next path. But for people who decide not to go to college, is it going to be an apprenticeship? What kind of entry-level job are you going to have? And, we know from the statistics that many people spend years, trying to kind of figure out, what they're going to do and jumping from one thing to the next. So that's, fairly common. But in the north of England in the 1980s, just even the ability to jump from one job to the next wasn't really there. And I decided that I wanted to try to go to college, and I was applying. And my father said to me, basically one night as we were walking home from one of my many part-time jobs, this happened to be in a local pub, and he basically said, well, if you do go to college, Fiona, you're going to have to then, accept you're going to have to go somewhere else. He said, there's nothing for you here, pet. Yeah, it's got a pet being a term of endearment in the northeast of England. We didn't put that one on the title of the book. So because, if you go off to college, you're not going to be able to come back because, you'll have these qualifications, but there won't be any jobs here. So you'll have to start thinking about where you go next and what you do next. And that was, kind of a pretty wrenching discussion. But that was kind of, that's one of the themes of the book. It's of growing up in a place that was facing massive deindustrialization. My dad had been a coal miner. All the coal mines closed down. He didn't have any wherewithal to retrain. So he goes to work in the local hospital as a porter, an orderly, an ancillary worker. So right there at the very bottom rung of the labour force in the National Health Service. And he has no other prospects, after that, because he can't get any other qualifications. There's no funding for retraining, and his skills that he developed on the job as a miner just didn't translate. And this happens in every particular setting where there's been massive rapid deindustrialization, the closing of shipyards, steelworks, railway works, coal mines, you name it, big auto plants. We see that in the United States and in the UK. And I saw this in Russia when I started first traveling there and working there too. And people immediately get dislocated. And then the question is, how do they manage to move on from there? And if the place in which they live is one of the places where there's nothing for you here, a place where all the industry's left and nothing new comes in, then all of those big questions are, how do you get ahead? Do you actually have to physically move and seek opportunities somewhere else? So the main theme of the book, the through line, is really about opportunity. And, through my own story, I talk about how this lack of opportunity in different settings, my professional life moving from the UK to the Soviet Union, which then becomes Russia, and then to the United States, I see the same things happening. And then out of this, populist politics emerging, with people feeding off the grievances that are socioeconomic and cultural grievances, because people feel they've lost their identity and their sense of self. And eventually that feeds into the political system. And populist politicians who basically say, we're going to fix this, we're going to put things back, get you your jobs back, help you find yourself again, kind of come into the mix. And I saw that in every place. But my own personal experience of finding opportunity is one of travel overseas. I end up getting scholarships. I go to the University in St Andrews in Scotland first, but I get a scholarship to the Soviet Union, which opens the door to a scholarship to the United States. So education becomes the door to opportunity for me, even though that's not going to be necessarily the door for everyone else. And so by the end of the book, and the kind of theme is, how do we find opportunity? And that's the subtitle of the book, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century. And I, of course, found opportunity in the United States, hence the American flag on the front cover.
And so you've explained, because I knew the phrase, there is nothing here for you, was from your father about the north of England. And the other part, finding opportunity in the 21st century, seemed to be in conflict with that. But you've explained that wonderfully. It was a question both Victor and I had.
For sure. Yeah. And let's get into the more personal aspect of your story, maybe beginning with your childhood in the northeast of England in a coal town called Bishop Auckland. Can you describe for our audience that part of England and what that was like?
Well, there is a real geographic divide in the United Kingdom. And the north used to be, in ancient times, a whole new kingdom. So if anybody watched HBO's Game of Thrones, and there was this sort of like the division of the north with the Stark family, this is just ripped straight out of British history, because the northern part of England was always a world apart from the rest of the country. It was an ancient kingdom of Northumbria. There was different political systems that had developed there over time. My part of the north of England, County Durham, was ruled for centuries by prince bishops. They were often, the brothers of a king who were kind of basically sent off to become part of the church to put them out of the line of succession, but given basically the mandate to govern part of the country, in this case the north, against invasions as well, and to have an army against invasions from the Scots or whoever else was kind of coming along. So the north of England had this storied history. It's also the outer rim of the Roman Empire. We had Hadrian's Wall just further north of us. So that's kind of weird. Sort of for 300 years, we were the furthest reach of the Roman Empire. But we also were the cradle of the Industrial Revolution. And so in the 1800s, in the 19th century, the region boomed. And it was coal mining. The whole place was defined by coal, just like parts of Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, for example, and related industries, steelworks, there was shipbuilding, and then shipping in all the port cities in the region. Railways, it was kind of also the cradle of the railways, both industrial and freight railways and the passenger railway. And then it wasn't. So there was this huge boom period where the place was really on the maps of the entire world. Everybody knew about the north of England because it manufactured all of the goods. It was a bit like Silicon Valley, today, but very obviously different feel to it. And by the time I came along in the 1960s, that industry was all tapering off. It was either no longer competitive in a global sense, or the coal was, eventually being mined out. And the world had moved on also. I mean, the economy was modernizing, transitioning to the new knowledge economy with more emphasis on financial flows and, software and, other sort of systems development and the service sector. And the north of England just got completely left out of that because people's training and education system had all grown up around this big, heavy industry. And so, when I was growing up there, it was a place that was in the throes of a massive transition the kind of transition, frankly, we're going to have to go through now with moving to the green economy and, kind of an economy with artificial intelligence, with self-driving pretty much everything, including our houses won't need us. We won't even need to be there to like switch on a light or, put something on the stove. Everything will be done without us. I was reading an article the other day about how humans are going to become just like household pets, because the whole world is just going to be kind of trucking on without us. So that was even being an exaggeration, but I found that kind of amusing. But in any case, that will be another major dislocation from the workplace. And so that was my experience growing up in a place in constant flux, with people constantly losing their jobs, and everything turned on its head from what it had been before.
And I think that's what makes your book so relevant to us now, is because that seems to be one of the dominant political themes here in America, and what has led to Trump. But I want to go back to a part of your book that I particularly related to, which is the chapter about women's work. That's what you entitled it, was Women's Work. And I want to talk to you about at least two things there. One is what you describe as the gender pay gap, and the second is what you describe as the common pattern for working women and all the hurdles that women have encountered. So let's start with the gender pay gap, and not the statistics, which have improved. I mean, when I graduated law school, it was 59 cents on the dollar for a woman. And it's way more than that now. We're in the 90s now. But it's not 100%. And so,
that's right.
And there's still discrimination of many sorts. You describe what impact it had on you personally, and that's what I wanted to focus on, was not just the numbers, but how it made you feel like an outlier, or as what I said in my book, I felt like an outsider. And so can you talk about that part of it?
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, there are also other gaps in wages that, I mention in the book, but I don't talk about directly because, of course, I wanted to focus on my own authentic experiences. Mm-hmm. Although, I do give, some of the statistics, as I'm, sure you did too, Jill, because there's also a racial pay gap. So if you're a black woman or another minority woman or a woman with a disability, you've got even more of a problem. And then, there's just overall a lot of discrimination against, kind of various groups on a wage basis. But for women across the board, on average, according to all kinds of statistics and research at places like Harvard Business School, women are making, $20,000 a year less than men. And, irrespective of, where they are in the hierarchy of jobs, kind of blue collar, professional, higher echelons. And, I experienced it really early on in my career as soon as I got to the United States, and I didn't expect it. I know it sounds bizarre, but coming from a working class background in the United Kingdom, there was more transparency in the wages. People posted for a job, and that was going to be what the wage was. Now, admittedly, I was doing a lot of jobs that women were doing. When I was, trying to put myself through school, I did a lot of cleaning jobs. I was working in the local hospital as a cleaner, and they were mostly women. But the pay was really transparent. They said, here's the job, and I was going to have the exact pay of what you're going to be paid for by the hour. It was the same in bars and restaurants. And the bars, there were barmen. I just got the same pay as they did. And so when I got to the United States, and I'm getting my first proper professional job, I just sort of expect I was going to be paid the same as everyone else. I didn't realise until I was put in charge of, as I moved on, the budgets, as one of my administrative positions. And I looked at the budgets and was like, say what? Immediately seeing that, despite my qualifications and, the fact that I was actually at this point doing the job of two people, the guy who had been previously one of the people before me in the job that I was doing had been paid more than the other woman who was working with, and way more than me. And, I immediately asked about this, and I was told it was because of qualifications, because at this point I hadn't finished my PhD and, this and that and the other. But this just followed me throughout my whole career until a certain point. And I never made up the discrepancy. And at some points, as I describe in the book, it got worse. People would actually actively say, well, we're taking a risk on you because you're a woman. And I would collect these stories from other women. And actually, Jill, it's really admirable that you wrote about it as well and talked about it, because, a lot of women won't. They're embarrassed, particularly older women, because they don't want people to know that they're made so much less than their male counterparts, especially as everyone knows they're working just as hard, often harder. And as you said, it's not just you feel like an outsider, but you feel like you're valued less.
Yes.
And, there were people that I, kind of saw as trailblazers ahead of me, kind of women who were 20, 30 years old. And they'd say to me, look, when I was being interviewed for my job, people would say, well, what does your husband make? And why are you asking for so much if your husband's making about this amount? Or other people saying, well, you're just going to go off and have children. You're not allowed to ask that and say that anymore. So, of course, we're not going to give you, this pay. And I literally had people rather crudely in interviews earlier saying, well, yeah, well, are you getting married? Are you planning on having children? I'm not really so sure. And it's really only in 2009 when Lily Ledbetter, the manager from the Alabama tire factory, finds out that she has been grossly underpaid for her entire career because she's just about to retire, that things start to change because she actually sues her employer and eventually goes through the Supreme Court. Yeah. They throw it back, but eventually there's a bill in Congress in 2009 that basically gives women the right to, not just call out this discrepancy, but do something about it. And after that, I think you and I and many others do start to see things changing somewhat because there's then a reference point. But that, constant thing of saying, well, we're taking a bit of a risk on you because you're a woman for a variety of, either you're not a proven commodity, the qualifications, or we're just, not sure whether we can rely on you, or, you're just not a man. Kind of people, there was even discrimination built into the human resources department of other women would basically, kind of acquiesce to a man asking for a salary. But when a woman came along and did it, they were like, well, I don't know about that.
The experiences that you and I had are both very similar, but I retired in 2008. Or at least theoretically retired
so
in 2000.
You were just shocked. So you had the whole experience.
Right. When I was interviewing for jobs, things that were illegal, like asking about what your husband did, weren't illegal. And I was asked all those questions about how many children, what kind of birth control do you use? I can't even begin to tell you all the things. I was told that they couldn't hire me because I was a woman and everybody else in the job was a man, and it required travel, and they couldn't possibly let me travel with a man. So, yeah, I completely get it. And I think one of the points you make that I just want to stress is how this accumulates, because once you start out lower than the men, you go to the next job and they can pay you less because if they give you a 10% raise, it's a raise, but it's 10% from a base that you shouldn't have been at. And it can accumulate into hundreds of thousands of dollars over a career.
I at one point figured out that I was in arrears, so to speak, of $500,000.
Right,
and
exactly.
then the point that I make in the book is it's, I'm very fortunate, and how I've progressed through life. But if I was a single mother, and say I was a black single mother, or any minority single mother, a disabled single mother, anybody who's going to have even more discrimination there, that gets passed on to the next generation, to my family. Yeah. Because, women tend to be the head of households in single parent families. And then women are already discriminated against. So all of their kids are living with that kind of discrepancy. Yeah. Because, they're already not getting off to the same start as everyone else. And I also wanted to put it out there in the book for younger people, Victor, like you and your colleagues, so you'd be more attuned to this. Because it's not just for women, it's for anybody else who might be discriminated against in their wages, to know that this happens. And the only way to fix this is for people to work together in tandem, and to be open and transparent, and to push the places that they work to be open and transparent about salaries. Some places really are, and as you said, things have really changed, and all the places that I experienced that discrepancy earlier, they've changed a lot in the last 10 years. But we've just got to keep pushing for that.
Right, but I have to say that the discrimination I faced didn't go to wages. When I started, law firms offered all associates the same wage. Now, as you progressed, it might get differential, but at least at the starting point, you were equal.
Right.
And the same was true in government, where there's GS grading, and everybody in that grade gets the same. So I started as an 11, and all 11s made the same salary. And I think what's interesting, though, is you point to the Lilly Ledbetter Act in 2009, and when we went to see a movie called Made in Dagenham, have you ever seen that?
Yes.
We walked out, and my husband said, I can't believe that was going on in England in 1968. And I said, honey, do you know what's going on in America? The first official act of President Obama was to sign the Lilly Ledbetter Act, which gave a right for people to sue going retroactively. And he had no idea that we were 40 years behind or 30 years behind England on this. So I just want to end on this segment with turning to page 144 of your book. I don't know if do you have the book in front of you? You could read it, or if you don't.
I've got it behind me. My publicist made me put it behind me.
Okay.
Then I'll have to put my glasses on. Because
Okay, that's okay.
Let me try and find it here. 144.
The first full paragraph, I think, sort of summarizes to me the overall problem we're talking about in terms of discrimination against women.
I'll put my glasses on for this. As you get older, you need extra money for glasses.
Either that, or you need contact lenses that are monovision, right?
Yeah, that'll be good.
So the part that says,
you want me to read this?
Yeah, these experiences were part.
Okay, yeah. So these experiences were a part of a common pattern for working women. Men get more pay because they ask. Men are viewed as strong when they ask for money, women appearing grasping or greedy. Men always seem to have more leverage in a negotiation than women. Employers presume men will walk away if they don't get what they want. They have more options, they have more job options because they're men. Women always fear that they have fewer options and there will be untoward consequences. Somehow walking away from a bad pay offer or calling out a discrepancy will be held against them. They will earn a reputation for being difficult. As was the case for me, hiring managers push women to take what's offered and ask for a pay raise once they have proved themselves on the job. Women are a risk. Men are a proven quantity. The cumulative opportunity and monetary cost of all this bias against women, individually and collectively, is extremely high. Yeah, I had all of those fears, those concerns. I still find it, honestly, my husband's always going on at me about it. I still find it hard asking for money.
Okay, so we have to get you trained in how to negotiate.
Yeah, I know, but this is the thing. I remember once, hearing about a colleague who was going for kind of a big new job with a private corporation. They hired a lawyer, and I thought, what? Yeah, and now I think, of course, she had to hire a lawyer because she didn't know, whether she was going to be basically getting the same compensation. So, it's all been a learning curve for me as well. I'm in my 50s, well and truly now, and I'm still learning, about these kinds of things. But I do think that, for more vulnerable women who are the heads of households, looking after their kids, it's really important that as a society that we understand this, because it has multi-generational impacts in a very negative way. And as I said, the cumulative cost is huge.
Definitely. I think it's something that, like you said, we need to all address, men and women working together to address this problem. I want to turn to perhaps a different subject, and that is the rise of authoritarianism. Your book suggests that the authoritarian rise of Putin foreshadowed the rise of would-be authoritarians like Nigel Farage in England and Donald Trump here in the U.S. Is this just a coincidence, or is there something disturbingly similar between the three countries and those leaders?
Well, I think there's a moment. I could have actually, put this in a much larger context, right? Because we seem to be in that this populist moment. There's President Erdogan of Turkey, for example. There's Prime Minister Orban in Hungary. There is, he's not the Prime Minister or the President in Poland, but there's Mr. Kaczynski, who's the head of the ruling party in Poland, who has a huge popular and populist influence from behind the scenes. And, there's Bolsonaro in Brazil, there's Modi in India. That kind of style of governance has got resonance for this moment. And I think it's because we're in such a complex period in global history. We have a crush of really difficult crises on our hands. It's not just the pandemic, because this preceded it, and climate change, but we are in one of those other major transitions, right, from one economic system to another, with the advent of artificial intelligence, the changes, the knowledge economy. It's already, taking shape even further. We're facing the green revolution, which is we're going to have to contemplate because of climate change, and massive socioeconomic dislocation is a feature in pretty much every society at the moment, plus massive demographic change. And although you don't see that quite so much in Russia, although there's been a lot of migration into Russia from Central Asia, the former Soviet republics, and from some other countries as well, we in the United States are at a tipping point, as we're all aware. Depending on the statistics, by 2045, the United States is going to be majority minority. We're becoming much more diverse. Your generation, Victor, is the most diverse in American history. In the UK, that's already happened in places like London, where there's a massive flip of the population. I mean, the place where I grew up in is still like 98% white, but that's not London, for example, is one of the most multi-ethnic, multicultural, diverse cities on the planet, like New York and Los Angeles and many others. And so a lot of people are having a hard time adjusting to the fast pace of change. So they're looking for somebody to sort of slow it down a bit for them, sometimes even sort of take it back a bit, or somebody just to tell them that they can kind of, keep them all in the position that they've grown accustomed to. Because an awful lot of people are going, this is too fast for me. I don't like this change. I don't like where this is all heading. And if someone steps in and says, it's all right, I've got it all under control. I'm going to put it all back. I'm going to fix all of the problems that we have. That's very appealing, particularly if they're coming up with, very straightforward, quick time sort of solutions for these complex problems. Because, we all know that in public policy, people like myself from the Brookings Institute, we come up with these big long programs and sort of policy briefs on how to fix things. It's so much easier than just say, we just need to do this, or we just need to do that. President Trump said, we've got a problem with immigration, build a wall. So this is kind of the straightforward explanation or solution for the problem. And people find that appealing. Particularly if somebody said, look, and I understand that you feel that you've lost your position, you've lost your status, you've lost your job, you've lost all of this, loss. I can give it back to you again. I can make you whole.
So let's perhaps focus on the rise of Trump. Your book focuses not so much on Trump himself, but instead on the conditions that fed his rise to presidency. What are the factors you think led Trump to become president in 2016?
Well, I mean, one of the factors that everybody was focused on was, of course, the Russian intervention in the 2016 election. And I tried to kind of make it clear in the book that although the Russians most certainly interfered and they messed around and they no doubt had an impact on helping to shape some people's opinion, the factors that produced Trump were not related to Russian operatives masquerading as Americans on the internet, because all they were doing was basically picking up on the divisions and just trying to stoke further discord, pouring fuel on already a fire that was burning. So, I mean, the factors are this long period of deindustrialization that I talked about and places getting left behind in the United States, not just in the United Kingdom. So there are many places in the United States very similar to the northeast of England that lost the mainstays of their economy, be it steelworks or coal mines. I mean, think about what we call the Rust Belt. It wasn't always called the Rust Belt. That was the heartland of American manufacturing. We talk about the Rust Belt now as if it was always, filled with rusty factories. Back in the day, particularly after World War II, up until, the 60s and 70s, and sometimes in the case of the 80s, these were some of the most vibrant, productive cities in America, the places that were, driving the economy. Detroit, Flint, Michigan, Dearborn, Michigan, and many of the great big places at Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. I mean, these were the heartland and the lungs, they used to kind of call it, of America, with all the big manufacturing plants. And so when all the jobs go away in places like that and nothing comes back, you get kind of the grievance. We've also seen, unfortunately, particularly since the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009, an increase in really, terrible health outcomes for people. So Angus Dayton from Princeton University and his wife Anne Case have done this research on the deaths of despair, showing the increase in poor health and mortality rates, opioid addiction, depression, you name it, in the old industrial heartlands where people have lost their jobs and as a result of it have lost their identity. And that and many other factors, our partisan politics, the degeneration of our political parties, the emergence of different factions and groups, the sort of polarization on cultural and, many other issues, this demographic change that I was talking about earlier, all fed in to an environment of divisiveness and dislocation for many people. And that is the kind of environment that Donald Trump emerged out of. He's a symptom, not a cause of all of it. And we have to remember that he was one of 17 candidates in the primaries for the Republican Party. And all of those candidates, they couldn't find the right formula to connect with people. They kind of knocked themselves out of contention. And Trump, having been a reality TV showman and somebody who understood the working class because he employed many of them in his family construction companies across the United States, especially in Brooklyn and Queens, New York, and you name it, the places that were in transition in New York itself. He just kind of understood better than anyone really what was going on and how to talk to people and how to basically pick up on the things that were making them angry and frustrated and to channel it.
I mean, he really tapped into those grievances and that anger and frustration, like you said. And I'm wondering what you think are some of the warnings that the 2016 election should have shown about the state of the country.
Well, look, I think if we hadn't been all so obsessed about Putin and what the Russian security services might have done, we might have already seen all of the warning signs, because there were many, right? We saw all of this. And in fact, kind of President Obama himself, his predecessor, had seen this too. And President Obama came into office on the back of that very different message of hope and change, not a message of American carnage and, how everything is really dreadful and I've got to kind of protect you. But he was addressing the exact same issues. And unfortunately, over the course of, the 8 years that he was in office, many of the issues, remained untackled. He did go a long way to try to address some of the social issues with Obamacare. Of course, there was a massive backlash against that, but trying to deal with the health outcomes that were so negative in the United States. I mean, by being the first Black president, his election in itself was an attempt to try to address this demographic change and the racial divisions, but of course he was also walking in eggshells the whole time. And, we didn't have that big, debate about race that we've actually had since George Floyd's death, for example. There were, it's also the timing because of, the forever wars. I mean, the United States by this point had got itself into two major conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I don't really talk about this in the book, but the real legacy of 9/11 and the way that shaped the United States and the pressures and the tensions that helped create are also a part of that. And President Obama wasn't able to disentangle, from that. So by the time we get to the election of 2016, there's still a lot of really unfinished business. And then the different tone comes in, because certainly President Obama's goal was to try to reconcile, was, to try to bring people together. Donald Trump, President Trump saw that division was his kind of ticket, dividing people up, not trying to reconcile, do the exact opposite, was his ticket to the presidency. And so he doubled down on it. So, unfortunately, we're in a kind of a place where the pendulum swung one way and then, swung in the other direction. And this is the challenge for all of us now, is trying to figure, how do we move forward from here? How do we address all of these divisions, the problems that we saw in 2016, but we got diverted by, look over here at Vladimir Putin. And yet, the security service in Russia saw these very clearly. And that's what they were playing with. They were exploiting it. So our divisions are and will be a national security challenge for us. They're a real risk.
So it seems like you were quite concerned about Trump in 2016. Did you have any concerns about being in the administration, or what did you try to do when you got asked to serve in the administration?
Well, my focus was really in the administration on Russia, but, it was inescapable that we had domestic problems, but I'd been very much laser focused on what could we do about dealing with Russia, knowing what I did about Putin and all of the issues that we were going to have to deal with. And, of course, I discovered over the course of my time there that the domestic and foreign policy were inextricably linked. And of course, the kicker moment for that becomes the one that we all see, during the first impeachment trial, which is when Trump tried to engage with Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, to get him to jump into American politics, invited in this case, unlike the Russians in 2016, to basically open up investigations of Joe Biden and his son Hunter Biden, to basically cast questions on his candidacy for the presidency during the 2020 election. And that's the kind of a moment where I, like everybody else, really saw that you can't extricate the domestic from the foreign policy. And all the time that I was there were all these efforts going on to privatize our foreign policy and national security policy. So my big qualms are really in that period as I'm coming out about, it was obvious that you couldn't do anything about national security policy as I'd assumed you could without really addressing the domestic front. I mean, I got a pretty cold, harsh, rude awakening on that one, that, kind of domestic and foreign policy are intertwined. Of course, I'd been writing about that in the Russian case for years. And then I see that it's exactly the case in the United States, because our domestic politics have become so messy, that all of the foreign policy dimensions are now not separate, they're all intertwined.
Mm-hmm. So you focused on addressing Russia, and in so doing, you had to interact with Trump many times, and you describe many moments in which you had to interact with Trump. There's one striking moment in your book when you describe wearing sneakers as you entered the West Wing. Before entering the Oval Office, General McMaster told you to make sure that your feet were out of the president's sight line. Can you talk more about that moment and why then you decided to always store a pair of sneakers, or I guess shoes, in your office, not sneakers?
Well, this is, hopefully, Victor, one of these moments that you'll, kind of never have to experience, but Jill might have been there before, when you're an older, working mother. And, in my case, I'd take the metro to, because I live at such a distance that it was a wash between driving and the metro. And I'd rather take my chance on the metro than just get stuck in traffic and, deal with road rage and everything else. And, kind of worry about actually getting there. So I would wear sneakers to go down to the metro. This was my first morning on the job, and my daughter had been ill all night. And so I was so confused, befuddled, no sleep, totally out of it in the morning. I thought I was just going to an orientation session. I put on my sneakers, I forgot my shoes, and I literally sprinted down to the metro, got on the metro, made it into the orientation session in time, and sort of sitting there going, God, thank God. And the next thing, I'm being called out to go to the Oval Office to help brief the president on a terrorist attack in the St. Petersburg metro that I've heard nothing about, because I've been dealing with a sick child. I've been on the metro. I've no idea. And I'm supposed to accompany I'm basically the National Security Advisor, General McMaster, and I haven't got my shoes. And I'm thinking, oh my God, really? I'm going to go to the Oval Office first day on the job in my sneakers. So I tried to borrow a pair of shoes, but there's no one with feet as big as me. So I'm the ugly stepsister in Cinderella. I can't find a pair of shoes to fit me. So I have to go there and stuff my feet, as General McMaster said, under the chair, sitting in front of the Resolute desk, right in front of me. The president didn't even look up at me, didn't care who I was anyway. I said my little spiel that I'd figured out what to say about the St. Petersburg metro. He calls Putin. He finishes calling Putin to say, sorry, it's a condolence call. And then Ivanka Trump walks in, and she's this vision in white lacy flowing dress in possibly high heels. I think she looks like she's going off to a gala. And I'm thinking, whoa, what's she doing here? First of all, I think to myself, then I realize, oh yeah, hey, she's an advisor, the president, his daughter. And she's just dressed up, as we'd said, to the nines. I mean, it felt like prom night or something. And I was really taken aback. And then she sits down next to me, and the first thing she sees is my great big black sneakers. So I am totally busted. So as soon as I've got back to the orientation session, finished that out, I run out to the nearest shoe store and buy a pair of shoes that fit me, that I can wear on every occasion. I put them under the desk in a box just so that I've always got them. So I'm not going to be caught out again. And they did not have impossibly high heels on them. They were, kind of these sort of, they had a heel, but they were kind of something that was interchangeable. But Jill, I'm sure you've been there, done that as well.
Oh, you brought up in my mind a horrible experience where I flew to Spain and had packed my heels. I flew in my gym shoes. But when I took them out, I had two left shoes that looked a lot alike, but they weren't a pair. And I went to buy a pair. I was in Spain. What better place? And there are no shoes big enough for me in Spain. Luckily,
because everyone's very petite in Europe. Exactly. They have small feet. There's something weird about it.
It was horrible. It was just the worst thing. But gosh. I luckily did find another Motorola woman who was at the same meeting who actually had two pairs of shoes, and they were my size. So I saved myself in that situation. But anyway, back to the Trump administration, which you describe as dysfunctional. And I think all of us have seen, examples of that, but I'd love to hear some of your highlights of that. And not just of the dysfunction of Trump, but the dysfunction, as you describe it, of the whole administration, which went beyond just the White House.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, this was, administration fighting with itself, because Trump had come into government without a team. I mean, he had a team, and a very small team, his family team, people who'd worked with him in his Trump business empire, and his literal family members, and a few people who'd been on his campaign, because it was a really small campaign team, with no frills attached, and essentially kind of little like a war room around him, and so he had to rely on the Republican Party, the Republican National Committee, to staff people for a lot of the positions, and kind of people to bring others in that they might have served with before. That's how I ended up coming in. I was approached by Katie McFarland, who had been named as the Deputy National Security Advisor, and General Flynn, who was the first National Security Advisor, very short-lived, who, in the case of General Flynn, had worked with me when I'd been at the National Intelligence Council. He'd been my counterpart in the chairman of the Joint Chiefs Office. It was Admiral Mullen at the time. And Katie McFarland had a Fox News show and invited me on several times to speak about Vladimir Putin and the books that I'd written. And I'd met her through the Council on Foreign Relations. And so, I got this basically call early on asking for some advice. And then, would I consider, a bit of a surprise a bit later, coming on board. And I also knew then several other people who had been brought on from the DNI or the military who I'd worked with, and others from around the government, and all of us who weren't connected to the president through the campaign or through his family and his other business were basically viewed with great suspicion. And that's where the dysfunction came from right away, because Trump was not part of the Republican Party. He wasn't part of the Republican Party apparatus for certain, but he just kind of hijacked the party on his way to the presidency. As I said before, he was one of 17 candidates. He was the wild card. Nobody expected him, to get elected. He wasn't a card-carrying Republican until, rather relatively recent. At one point, he'd even been registered as a Democrat. And he certainly had no previous government experience, which some people thought was his major selling point, actually. And indeed, previously Barack Obama had been elected as president very quickly after, just a very short period as being a, sort of junior senator, from Illinois. And so, here was Trump just sort of catapulted into the Oval Office. He thought he could run the whole place like he ran his family business. And that's really at the heart of it. And all of the stories really kind of come from there, because he also had no sense of how the government worked. He didn't see the need for all of the many of the departments and agencies, for sure. Certainly not for the National Security Council. He didn't really know what we all did. And his view was that information should flow down from him, not up. And eventually, anybody who came to work for him, be it Rex Tillerson, the former CEO of ExxonMobil, General McMaster, kind of a great war hero, General Kelly, also, kind of a general very famous, who becomes his chief of staff eventually, General Mattis, who becomes his Secretary of Defense. All of these people, he just sees them literally as that secretaries, particularly as the title of Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State. He kind of, tends to see them all as staff. And women, more than anything, unless it was Ivanka, and, a handful of women that he knew from his time working, with his own business enterprise, or, on his campaign, like Kellyanne Conway had run his campaign. You were just, just non-entities, non-players. You just didn't know what on earth you were doing there. So, for someone like me, I'm just this middle-aged woman who may or may not know something about Russia. Even, Secretary Tillerson, former CEO of ExxonMobil, Rex Tillerson, gets dismissed because by now he's the staff. And, that was kind of where all the dysfunction, the chaos came from. And that's how it played out across the rest of the government, because everybody was under suspicion. He wanted to almost dismantle the state. He didn't see the point of it. He wanted to run everything out of his own private circle in the White House, and took much more news, rather information and advice from Fox News. And many people would say, we're hearing about this in some of the inquiry into January 6th, that people felt they had to get on television, to get the president to, call back, the protesters and the mob, who had assaulted the Capitol building, because they couldn't get his attention in real time. He was so focused all the time on the TV, what people were saying on the TV. But once they then came into work from him, and there was a whole parade of them, they all soured on him, or he soured on them, and then, that was that. They were in and out very quickly.
An interesting perspective. But one other comment you had about him was that he had autocrat envy. And that may stem from his just desire to run things completely himself. But can you talk more about that and explain what you meant by autocrat envy?
I think it's also his perception of how power works. Because when we all heard him say in the run-up to the presidential election, and then once he secured the presidency, he thought that the president, the executive, from the executive branch, was the person who held all the power. So he certainly didn't believe in checks and balances. And again, it could well lead back to the time, of him being not the CEO, who's been recruited of a major company, but the head of a family firm that's been sort of set up, from the beginning, and that he sort of stepped into. I mean, he did not, kind of see the executive branch as existing. And so his kind of vision of the presidency and somebody who's being a president, somebody who's strong and powerful, keeps using those words, strong and powerful, and who has no checks and balances and essentially rules or governs as he pleases. And so he starts to see people like Putin in Russia, Orban in Hungary, Erdogan in Turkey, who actually has a lot of checks and balances on him, actually, more so than people might think. And then Xi in China. It's not Xi with the Communist Party and the big Chinese system, but Xi is the individual, the president who's pushed through term limits and looks like he's staying on in power too, as the kind of epitome of the kind of leader that he thought he should be, and he certainly wanted to be. And he said this. I mean, he says this to Woodward on the tapes, essentially saying that he's more of affinity with the stronger guys rather than the others who are in these much messier democratic systems and don't have that kind of power. He talks about how he'd like to be that. And, he said that, very openly in a place when I heard as well. He would quip, I wish I had the same situation like this. Or in press conferences, he would talk about wanting people to sit up and pay attention to him and, just praise him all the time. We saw in his cabinet meetings where he'd go around the table expecting everyone to praise him, making it very clear that they were, subservient to him. So, I mean, I observed this, every time that I was in his presence. And also you just pick up on it from what everybody else is saying as well. It was very clear that, again, that his autocrat envy stemmed from what he thought the American presidency should be. If it was the leader of the free world, the most important position in the world, in his view, then it ought to have that power that would come with it. The Queen of England was another of his autocrats, although we all know that she's not an autocrat, she's a constitutional monarch. Doesn't have a lot of authority and power. But in his view, she has all of the celebrity trappings that he also thought an autocrat should have.
Interesting, very interesting. Let's jump ahead to a moment that brought you into the public spotlight, and that is Trump's first impeachment hearing. And if you could just quickly describe to our audience, what led you to speak out against Trump at that time, and was it a difficult decision for you?
Well, look, I'd gone in to do public service. I'd gone in, really concerned about what the Russians had been doing, and I remained that throughout the whole time. But the way that they were exploiting, so many of our political divisions, the polarization, the partisan infighting, and all of these vulnerabilities that we'd developed. But I also, most firmly believed in congressional oversight and the checks and balances in the system, representational democracy. And Congress, has the right to hold the executive branch, the president, into account. And I'd taken an oath to the Constitution, not an oath to one guy. And although, this is with the Trump administration, it's supposed to be an administration, and people have to have responsibility for the things that they've done and be held to account for things that they've done. And so when I was subpoenaed, there was no question that I was going to go and do something, to basically step up and to, basically respond to the questions that the Congress wanted to pose to me. I mean, I didn't see it as a kind of a choice there. And although, there was efforts on the part of the White House to, try to stop me and others from testifying, especially those who were still in their jobs, I thought there was no question that I had to do it.
If only
I didn't know what they were going to ask me, honestly, because I had left in the week before this infamous phone call. But of course, Ukraine had been part of my responsibility. And I knew by that point when I'd left that there were a lot of problems. And I had myself been reporting up things that I'd seen. But I didn't know until I saw the transcript from the call that Trump himself had been directing everything. I'd kind of thought that other people like Rudy Giuliani and these other cast of characters, were more trying, for example, to get rid of our wonderful ambassador to Ukraine, Masha Ivanovic, because she was in the way of their own business and other interests, and they were trying to sell. It seemed very clear, President Trump a bag of goods about kind of conspiracy theories in Ukraine, and I wasn't really sure though where the direction was coming from, but that phone call made it 100% clear that it was Trump, that he was, kind of fully cognizant of everything that was going on and was, well and truly directing this as well.
I only wish that there were more members of the Trump administration that felt the way you did and had come forward and testified, or that would now come forward.
Well, there were a lot of other people who testified, though.
Yes.
I mean, I was not the only one, and there were a lot of people behind closed doors as well. There was a lot of people stepped up, and a lot of people had reported it up the chain already. So there was a preponderance of, people...
Yes.
coming forward, but there were people who decided not to, which is very much the case.
Exactly, and there's even more so now. But Victor, I know you wanted to talk about something at the end of the book.
Yeah, so near the end of the book, you provide some deep analysis of President Trump's coup attempt. You wrote that the coup attempt mirrored autocrats like Emperor Napoleon III and Nicolas Maduro. Talk about that a little bit more, and looking back on the Trump administration and his 2016 campaign, how predictable do you think January 6th was?
Well, I think the specifics of January 6th weren't necessarily predictable, right? I mean, we didn't know that Trump would have a rally on the ellipse and then, basically get everybody all revved up to go and storm the the Capitol building. But, I mean, there was an awful lot of effort being made to overturn the election and to, basically halt the transfer of power by legal means. I mean, there were so many court cases that had been instituted and calls for electoral recounts. But what we'd seen in terms, so I think it was entirely predictable that he was messing with the election and messing with, the electoral outcome, because it starts well before the phone call with looking around for kind of ways of trying to make sure that Joe Biden doesn't get any traction as a candidate or whoever else is running against him. Then after the impeachment trial, when he isn't really held to account, but he's definitely censored, at least, publicly in some way, he starts to double down. And he starts to talk down the election. And, we have a situation where colleagues that I'd worked with, like Chris Krebs from the Department of Homeland Security, who is in charge of this agency that's supposed to be pushing back against the Russians and other external efforts to intervene in our election, finds himself talking out against our president and trying to assure American voters that the actual, electoral process is pretty secure. And it's not, he's worrying not so much that he's not worrying that Vladimir Putin's going to steal, your mail ballot and the and the mail van, but that Donald Trump is going to somehow, find ways to, basically diminish postal votes, for example. So, you get this ridiculous situation where we've been worried about one thing and we're actually seeing our own president be the biggest threat to the successful outcome of the election, denying that, the elections are free and fair. And the American election system has been the gold standard for decades around the world. We have been the elections that everybody else has tried to emulate, certainly not now. But, I mean, he basically opens the floodgates for calling the elections falsified even before they've taken place. And we're seeing that, all happening now. So the fact that Donald Trump was trying to impede the elections, and then for sure, when he lost the election in both the Electoral College and the popular vote, and the popular vote by a huge margin, much more than he had lost in 2016. Although ironically, he gets 11 million more votes than he got in 2016. He immediately tries to basically say that the election was stolen. So the whole "Stop the Steal" movement starts, and so this idea of a coup. And basically an effort to prevent the transfer of executive power, a self-coup, because he's already in office, has a very long tail to it. It's happening in, basically full view of everyone. It becomes normalised. There's nothing clandestine about it. It's not sudden. It's just happening the entire time, which is why I think most people are kind of rubbing their eyes and, they're disbelieving this. Because, when you think of a coup, you think of a sudden military uprising. We just had one in Sudan where the prime minister was taken into custody by the military, a full-blown military coup. That's not what we had. But President Trump certainly tries to whip up militias at different points. He does try to kind of influence the armed military to do things in his support. And it's still happening. I mean, we're having the whole events of what happened on January 6th questioned, efforts to dismiss the committee that's trying to investigate it, more efforts to cast questions about elections. We're basically in a massive constitutional crisis ongoing.
I mean, given that fact that, voter restriction and suppression laws are being passed around the country and Republicans continue to obstruct the January 6th committee and refuse to get to the bottom of it, how likely do you think another coup attempt is?
Well, as I said, we're still seeing it because, we're seeing the ground being prepared for a challenge to an outcome of the 2024 election and maybe the 2022 midterms, where if votes don't quite come down, where Trump and people around him are expecting that they're going to challenge it. I mean, it's going to be by not legal means, but we've seen legal coups happen before in other countries. In Turkey, for example, where, the court system and, the judiciary are generally, used, for example. We're in this. This is happening. This is unfolding. And if we look around the world, we can see many other examples where if it was happening in an allied country, we would be ready to at least stage some kind of intervention in the sense of, hey, we're your friends, we're really worried about what's happening here. You need to get a grip. Not a military intervention, but just basically, we would be doing this. If this was happening in the UK or Italy or, somewhere else, Germany, we'd be really concerned and trying to figure out what we could do to mediate.
It seems to me what you're describing is a possible destruction of our democracy by these means. And you mentioned Germany, and I'm sorry, but that was another place where the government was changed through legal means. And everybody there said it can't happen here. We don't have to worry.
Absolutely.
And do you think we're at a stage where we should be calling out the troops? I don't mean military troops. I'm talking about citizens. That citizens who care.
Yes, to kind of get everybody mobilised. Yeah, you've got to be careful about the language that you use. Given the circumstances. Yeah, I mean, look, I also liken it to 1990s Russia, or kind of Russia in other periods as well, where we've seen real setbacks to democracy. And kind of for a lot of people feel it's illegitimate somehow to raise 1930s Germany because of what happened later with the Holocaust, and no evidence of a final solution or some of the horrors that we saw there. But 1930s Germany is a very important analogy because there was an awful lot of people in the existing German system who enabled what happened next because they thought that, their own agendas were being furthered by this. They had no idea of how things were going to play out, but they also dismantled their democracy, in power plays or, for economic reasons, social reasons, because they just didn't think that it could happen. It couldn't happen here, like you said. So kind of in Russia since coming into power in 2000, Putin has kind of rolled back a lot of the advances that were made in democracy using the constitution, using legal means, and and the ballot box, and just manipulating it at every turn. Every democracy that's got itself in trouble. I mean, there are books by Daniel Ziblatt and Steve Levitsky at Harvard about how democracies are lost. How democracies end. This is a pattern. We are in the same pattern as other countries. We feel that we're exceptional, but unfortunately, we're proving to be unexceptional right now. Although the circumstances of the loss of our democracy will be, our very own. And we haven't seen the storming of a major government building in the United States for centuries. In the last time the Capitol came under assault. But this looked like the storming of the Bastille, or the storming of the Winter Palace, in 1917 in Russia. I mean, it should be shocking to every American, a protest getting out of hand like this, the storming of the U.S. Capitol building, as if it was a symbol of repression.
Well, you've certainly frightened me, and there's a part of me that thinks there's no more dramatic ending to this podcast than what you've just said. But I sort of hate to end on such a dismal note, and I know that in your book you talk about some solutions, and so I'd like to maybe talk about a little bit about how we can move forward from where we're at and make America safe for democracy again, unite the people.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you said, I mean, this is a time for people to step up. And, Victor, it's definitely time for, your generation, to come forward as well. And, the title of this podcast is Intergenerational Podcast, right? We need an intergenerational response because, this is your future that everybody's messing around with here. And, all of us have to put we the people, back into our politics. Because although we are a republic with a representational democracy, and people are often saying, well, we're a republic more than anything, we have representatives. I don't feel that our representatives are really representing us writ large at the moment. I mean, you don't just represent in a representational democracy the people who voted for you. And every state in the United States tends to be more purple than red or blue. And, I am not a partisan person. I don't feel that I can find my reflection in, kind of either the Republican or the Democratic Party. It's not my first point of identity to identify myself politically. I identify myself as an American. And then all the other kinds of things come on board. I'm deeply disturbed that the America that I came to in 1989 now has people identifying themselves, first of all, when I say, hi, who are you? Hi, I'm Bob, I'm a Democrat, or hi, I'm Jim, I'm a Republican. That's absurd. I can't imagine that. Hi, I'm a Republican. Hi, I'm a Democrat. On those labels, we'd have it at a party or something, or kind of a mixer. I mean, this is not where we should be as an advanced country at this particular point. So we have to figure out ways of getting across this, not just bridging divides, but basically getting out there and making our voices heard by being politically engaged on issues that matter a lot to us, contacting our congressperson and saying, look, you're representing me as well. And I want, kind of this to stop. Like if you're, a congressperson is somebody who's buying into the big line of conspiracy, write to them, get in touch with them, say stop, throwing at the democracy away at a time when we need collective action. Right now, we've got, we just had the G20 and this meeting in Glasgow for climate change. This is the 26th meeting, that's been happening on a regular annual basis to get some progress on climate change. I don't want to say again, we said we wouldn't end on a dark note. I don't want to say we're doomed here, but we do need to get collective action. We've got things that all of us are going to be affected by. The pandemic has affected us all. Climate change really is going to affect all of us. It already is. And so, how do we get our members of Congress into particular to realise that they're representing us in this republic? And how do we get our own voices there? And at the back of the book, I actually go through a whole host of things that individuals can do to create opportunity, because partly, we need to show people that they still have the opportunity to be themselves, to get a good job, to get an education, and to kind of, live their best lives in the United States. All of us, we're all in this together. And I do think we can make a lot of difference in the community in which we're part of, the networks in which we're part of, and it's certainly at the state and local government level. And just having this podcast, what you guys are doing now, having people from different generations, different backgrounds, talking to each other, having this opportunity, to air issues and to look at them from different vantage points, that's doing something too. But I just urge people to, when they've listened to the podcast or they've moved away from their screen, go out and physically do something, volunteer for something, especially, kind of for voter registration,
yes.
Getting out the vote, supervising, helping figure out how you can monitor elections. We used to do a lot of that overseas. We need to bring a lot of that,
yes.
back here. But also, reaching out to different people in your community for community service and bringing people from different backgrounds along to it as well.
Well, I think you have brought us to a happy place, because there's nothing more powerful than giving voice to individuals' concerns and advising people to get out there and take action. Write to your congressman,
right.
to your congresswomen, to your senators. They do listen, and not just when you are voting, but they listen as you contact them. So please follow Fiona Hill's advice and read her book. You will enjoy it, and I'm going to hold up the copy of it again, which says, "There is nothing for you here," but ends with finding opportunity in the 21st century. So it ends on a hopeful note. And we thank you so much for being with us today, Fiona.
Oh, it's always a pleasure, Jill and Victor. I mean, it's really nice to see you. That's great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed today's episode as much as we did, and that you will come back, listen again, or watch us on YouTube, and follow us so that you can always be informed about the next episode of iGen Politics. Thanks for being here.